Well, thank you for clicking on the link to this, my second contribution to this series of virtual club talks for members of the Flight Refuelling Amateur Radio Society. I've decided to stick with my family history theme, and I want to share with you today the story of the breaking of Dover Gaol. As you've seen, I've given it the rather snappy subtitle of The Audacious Rescue of One of My Ancestors by a Large Number of Rough, Rude Men. All will become clear as the story unfolds. The story is set almost exactly 200 years ago, and it concerns smuggling in the Kent area. And this brief newspaper report sets the scene very nicely. On Wednesday morning, a smuggling galley was sent into Dover, captured by the lively excise cutter, Captain Lilburn, and the crew, consisting of 11 men, lodged in the jail. So before I go into the story, I just want to give you a little bit about the background. Smuggling across the whole of the south coast of England was absolutely rampant at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th. And the trouble is that the authorities were having all sorts of trouble in controlling it, mainly because they had divided their efforts into a number of different organisations. And it was in 1816 that a Captain William McCulloch proposed bringing together, all under one command, anti-smuggling shore patrols, inshore water patrols and offshore cruiser activity. This would allow him to benefit from sharing of intelligence and also to give him better management of some fairly limited resources. 4 years later, in 1820, the year of course in question, the service comprised 6,708 officers and men, including more than 2,000 men on 31 Royal Navy ships, all under the command of Captain McCulloch. This was the Coast Blockade Service. Many of the men on the Royal Navy ships were drawn from the lowest ranks, carrying out the most menial tasks. This obviously wasn't the most popular posting in the fleet. They could only be kept in check using really strict discipline, and that earned Captain McCulloch the nickname of Flogging Joey. Now, this is the only image I could find of Flogging Joey McCulloch, and I think you can tell the painting was probably done fairly early on in his naval career. Firstly, he looks to be a very young man here, and secondly, a number of you will, I'm sure, have noticed on his collar the insignia of a midshipman, almost identical to the badges worn on the lapels by midshipmen even today. Now, although smuggling was rife, it was a very dangerous activity. Smugglers were known to be shot and killed by excise men. Some smugglers for particular crimes were hanged for their activity, and even smugglers found guilty of relatively minor offences could be punished by serving 5 years in the Royal Navy. Now, as someone who spent 31 years in the Royal Navy, I just wonder what crime I must have committed in a previous life to deserve such punishment. I love this image, and I'd love a pair of those boots. Although a lot of smugglers were punished by serving 5 years in the Navy, they did earn admiration from a number of senior officers, and this is quite a telling quote. These men are as remarkable for their skill as for their audacity in the hour of danger. Their local knowledge has been highly advantageous to the Navy, into which, however, they never enter unless sent on board ships of war as a punishment for some crime committed against the revenue laws. They are hardy, sober, and faithful to each other beyond the generality of seamen, and when shipwreck occurs, they've been known to perform deeds not exceeded in any country of the world. Praise indeed by Captain Brenton of the Royal Navy. So what actually happened in May 1820? Well, on the 25th, the excise cutter Lively, commanded by Lieutenant Billy Lilburn, caught 11 Folkestone smugglers on a run out of Boulogne. Billy Lilburn was known to be a particularly zealous excise man, and he'd earned the nickname Hellfire. And I'll give you an example in just a few minutes as to how he earned that particular title. The smugglers were taken to Dover, where they were locked up in the jail awaiting transfer to a prison hulk, and from there of course they'd be shipped out to various Royal Naval vessels to serve their 5-year sentence. However, the following day, on the 26th of May, when they were due to be taken to the prison hulk, a large and unruly mob of men and women came across from Folkestone. They went up to the jail and broke down the door in an attempt to release the 11 smugglers. They discovered that the smugglers had been moved to the back of the jail, the most secure area, and in their frustration they started literally to pull the prison apart, dismantling it by ripping off the roof and tearing down the walls. Troops were called in from Dover Castle to maintain some sense of law and order, and the mob began pelting the troops with a hail of stones and tiles that they'd removed from the jail. At that point, the mayor appeared, Sir Thomas Mantell. He stood on a rostrum and twice read to the crowd the Riot Act. Needless to say, he was completely ignored, and a small group of women from the crowd actually attacked him, and he gave up and ran away. A witness to this event recalled that presently the women, regardless of all consequences, charged like furies down upon his worship, snatched the document from him, that was the Riot Act of course, tore it into fragments and scattered them to the winds. Ooh, fearsome. Okay, so what happened next? Well, Lieutenant Lilburn and an unknown senior military officer arrived on the scene. Some sources declare that it was flogging Joey McCulloch himself who turned up. True to form, Hellfire Lilburn tried enthusiastically to persuade the senior officer to order the troops to fire on the growing crowd. However, he was told that if he wished to see bloodshed, then he must give the order to open fire himself. Probably just as well that he didn't actually do that. Eventually, the 11 smugglers were all released from the jail, and they escaped in post-chaises. A post-chaise being a horse-drawn carriage, the forerunner of today's taxis. On their way out of town, they stopped at a blacksmith shop near the Red Cow Inn to have the chains removed from their hands, and then they carried on to Folkestone and made good their escape. Meanwhile, back in Dover, the mob rampaged through the town, smashing windows, forcing the traders to close and barricade shops, and damaging the jail beyond repair. And I was rather amused to find a couple of months later in July an advertisement in the Kentish Gazette inviting tenders for the construction of a new jail for the town. And September that year, the foundation stone of the new jail was laid by the mayor. Most interestingly, none of the 11 smugglers was ever recaptured, despite there being a fairly generous reward on offer. The story was nicely summed up by this article in the Kentish Express. On or about the 25th of May 1820, an excise cutter arrested a smuggler's boat out at sea. The boat was found to contain 57 half anchors of spirits and 37 bags of tea. A half anchor, by the way, was 4 gallons. We're talking in excess of 200 gallons of spirits here, probably brandy. And when we're talking about bags of tea, we're not talking about what you and I know by a tea bag. We're talking great big bags. The crew were brought ashore and placed in Dover jail awaiting removal to a prison hulk, and the time of this removal was set for midday, May the 26th. However, when the town mayor and several constables went to effect the removal, they found the jail blocked by a large number of rough, rude men. And you may remember that's a phrase I used in the subtitle for this presentation. A full riot began and ended with a number of wounded to both sides. However, the smugglers did climb onto the jail roof and break in, removing a section of the wall as they did so. A rather longer version of the story was even reported in the London Times under the dramatic headline, "Riot at Dover." So, who were these 11 dastardly smugglers? Stephen Warman, John Stubbles, John Marshall, William West, Richard Grayland, Amos Cullen, William Fox, James Minter, Francis Roberts, Thomas Minter, and the name you've all been waiting for, Richard Hart. So, what's my interest in Richard Hart? Well, he was my great-great-great-great-grandfather, born in Folkestone in October 1791, and in 1813 he married Mary Jeffrey, the daughter of John and Elizabeth Jeffrey. Between them they had 16 children between 1814 and 1844, and I just wonder, with all those mouths to feed, it's hardly surprising, is it, that he decided to supplement his income with a little free trading to add to his normally legitimate fishing activities. I'm descended from their 7th child, John Jeffrey Hart, and interestingly this is the first instance of the name John Hart in my Hart family tree, and it appeared all the way down. Those of you who listened to my first presentation will remember my grandfather was a John Hart, as was my father, and my middle name is John, and the middle name of my oldest son is also John, and here's where the origins of that name came from. Richard died in 1879 at the ripe old age of 87. That's quite a decent age for someone who led a clearly fairly stressful life, and also at that time. And he's buried in Cheriton Road Cemetery in Folkestone. A few years ago my wife and I went to search him out, but unfortunately there was no sign of his headstone. Richard wasn't the only one of my ancestors with a deep involvement in smuggling. Some 50 years earlier, Henry Jeffrey, the grandfather of Richard's wife Mary, was shot and killed by excise men when he was caught red-handed on the beach in Sandgate, just a couple of miles west of Folkestone. Interestingly, this cigarette card is based upon that incident, and you can see there's an excise man in the bow of the boat with a pistol, and at the very right-hand side of the card there is a smuggler who appears to be returning fire, and that's believed to be Henry Jeffrey. A couple of years after the 1820 incident, in 1822, a more distant relative of mine, John Fagg, also of Folkestone, was actually hanged for smuggling-related offences. A couple of weeks after this incident took place, the Corporation of Dover posted this advertisement. I'm not going to read the first paragraph to you. It basically explains what happened on the 26th of May, and it names the 11 smugglers, and I note that Richard Hart's name is the very first in the list. The second paragraph, however, is well worth reading. It says, "Whoever will give information to Sir Thomas Mantell, Mayor of Dover, so that any one or more of the person or persons guilty of the said daring outrage and felony may be brought to justice, shall receive a reward of £100, and whoever will apprehend and bring to His Majesty's jail at Dover any one of the 11 smugglers thus lawlessly released shall receive a reward of £50 for every smuggler so apprehended and brought to jail." So all in all, there's quite a lot of money on offer here for anybody who's prepared to bring in any of those people who released the smugglers or any of the smugglers themselves. Some years later, a folk song was written commemorating this whole event, and it tells the tale from one of the smugglers' point of view. Don't worry, I'm not going to sing, that would be terrible, but instead I'm going to read this folk song to you because I think it's a really good tale. Here we go. We smuggling boys are merry boys, sometimes here, sometimes there. No rent nor taxes do we pay, but a man o' war is all our fear. 'Twas on the 25th of May, as you will understand, we sailed out of Boulogne Bay, bound for the English land. But to our sad misfortune, and to our great surprise, we were chased by two galleys belonging to the excise. Oh then, my boys, for liberty, was the cry of one and all, but soon they overpowered us with powder and with ball. They dragged us up to Dover Gaol in irons, bound like thieves, all for to serve great George our King and force us to the seas. The wives for their husbands were in such distress, for children round the gaol were crying fatherless. And sure the sight was shocking for anyone to see, but still the cry came from the mob, for death or liberty. Oh then, a hole all in the wall was everybody's cry, and Lilburn and McCulloch's men were soon obliged to fly. For bricks and tiles flew so fast from every point you see, and these poor men from Dover Gaol, they gained their liberty. And now they've gained their liberty, the long wide world to range. Long life to the Dover women, likewise to the Folkestone men. Fabulous. Before finishing, I'd just like to let you know that the burial record for Richard Hart described his trade or occupation as gentleman. Now, for most of his contemporaries, their trades were recorded as fisherman, seafarer, mariner, that kind of thing. Smuggler was probably unwise, but gentleman was quite unusual. Was this merely a mark of respect for an elderly retired fisherman, or could it have been a reference to his smuggling career? Smugglers were often referred to as gentlemen, and perhaps most famously so in Rudyard Kipling's poem, The Smuggler's Song. I'm going to read the poem to you, and it basically is the words of a smuggling father talking to his young daughter, and I think the image up on the screen at the moment conveys the scene quite nicely. Here we go again. If you wake at midnight and hear a horse's feet, don't go drawing back the blind or looking in the street. Them that ask no questions isn't told a lie. Watch the wall, my darling, while the gentlemen go by. 25 ponies trotting through the dark. Brandy for the parson, baccy for the clerk. Laces for a lady, letters for a spy. Watch the wall, my darling, while the gentlemen go by. Running round the woodlump, if you chance to find little barrels, roped and tarred, all full of brandy wine. Don't you shout to come and look, nor use 'em for your play. Put the brushwood back again, and they'll be gone next day. If you see the stable door setting open wide, if you see a tired horse lying down inside, if your mother mends a coat cut about and tore, if the lining's wet and warm, don't you ask no more. If you meet King George's men dressed in blue and red, you be careful what you say and mindful what is said. If they call you pretty maid and chuck you 'neath the chin, don't you tell where no one is, nor yet where no one's been. Knocks and footsteps round the house, whistles after dark. You've no call for running out till the house dogs bark. Trustees here and pinchers here, and see how dumb they lie. They don't fret to follow when the gentlemen go by. If you do as you've been told, likely there's a chance you'll be given a dainty doll all the way from France, with a cap of Valenciennes and a velvet hood, a present from the gentleman along a being good. 25 ponies trotting through the dark. Brandy for the parson, baccy for the clerk. Them that asks no questions isn't told a lie. Watch the wall, my darling, while the gentlemen go by. So here's the question. Was Richard Hart a hero or was he a villain? And I suppose as a third generation to serve in the Royal Navy, I should really think of this man as a villain. 200 years ago, it could have been my job a little while back to actually hunt down and imprison people like this. But I must admit I can't help feeling a little sense of pride and yeah, just a little sense that he's something of a family hero too. So there we are, 200 years ago, another incident from my family history. I hope you've enjoyed it. As you can see, I come from a fairly interesting family. 73 and all the best until next time. Bye now.